So let's talk about ice. You know, not the stuff you put in your cold drinks on a hot summer day. Not the diamonds and the jewelry that you give your lady when you want to impress her. We're talking about the police force that this current administration has deployed across the country. You know, that federal police force that has been deployed not to enforce the law, but really just to invoke fear. The one that been generating headlines, confusion, and chaos. Every week, every news cycle, it's always something coming up about what ICE done did. Well, they're at it again. ICE is at it all over again. But this time, as you guys know, they've been in Minnesota. And I want to make sure I get it right. They've been in Minnesota for the past few weeks. And this time, we have a story out of Minnesota in which ICE agents have killed a motorist that their claim were trying to run over them, that they were trying to hurt them, and so in a response, in self-defense, they unalived a woman in Minnesota. That's the official line. However, the footage has come out, and the footage tells a different story. What we've seen in this situation is a pattern that we've actually seen quite a few times in U.S. history before. Just in this past year alone, there have been multiple incidents, and I do mean multiple, in which federal agents fired into vehicles, claimed imminent threat, and then quietly revised the narrative once the video resurfaces. And of course, being Black American, we know that this happens in our communities all the time. Which is exactly why the mayor of Minneapolis, said this.
And I have a message for ICE. To ICE, get the out of Minneapolis. We do not want you here. Your stated reason for being in this city is to create some kind of safety, and you are doing
and that raises, for me, a real question. Why does this moment that we're in feel so historically familiar? Because it is. It is familiar. In fact, ICE doesn't just resemble something from the past. It actually just echoes it. To me, this is nothing but slave patrol logic modernized. The slave patrols, as you guys know, which came to be in the middle of the 19th century, they were not about justice. They were about containment, control, really protection of property rights of non-enslaved people. It was about movement control, about deciding who belonged in public spaces and who did not. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, the law itself was immoral, and enforcement became violence wearing legitimacy. Sometimes in history, we have seen where something was perceived as the law, but in reality, it was an immoral situation. And history keeps teaching us this same lesson time and time again in hopes that eventually we'll get the fucking lesson. Law does not determine morality. Morality determines whether the law deserves obedience. That brings us to the human cost of all of this. Somali communities in Minnesota, families, workers, residents are now living under constant surveillance and suspicion. Not because of crime, but because of status. We know that they used a fraud situation at a daycare that was predominantly ran by Somali nationals and Somali immigrants and residents in Minneapolis. But it wasn't orchestrated by a Somali. It was actually orchestrated by a white woman. However, that situation has been conflated to be a representation of criminal activity and fraud pushed on all Somalis, even though they have shown to be productive and well-behaved citizens of Minneapolis. Because the system has decided to permanently that these people, are permanently conditional, and that's important. When we hear the mayor says what he says in the clip, get the fuck out of the city, I don't hear radicalization. I don't hear anything radical at all. In fact, I hear historical literacy. If it walks like a slave patrol, and it operates like a slave patrol, and terrorizes communities like a slave patrol, then yes, get the fuck out of their city. And now it's time for Black News Now. Let's switch gears. A year ago in California, Southern California, we had the Eaton Fire, which destroyed so much. And today marks a year that happened in California. The fire killed at least 19 people. It destroyed more than 9,000 buildings, becoming one of the deadliest fires in modern U.S. history. But statistics don't tell the full truth of the Eaton Fire. The fire devastated a lot of places, but one of the places destroyed by the fire was the community of Altadena, California, which Altadena, California is a historically black community built by black homeowners who were locked out of Los Angeles city limits, Los Angeles proper, due to things like redlining and segregation and racism generally. And these people created a community there. It was a thriving, well-to-do black community. Altadena wasn't just housing. It was land ownership. It was generational stability. It was black self-determination in a state that rarely allowed it. And once again, when disaster strikes, black communities lose not just their homes, but their wealth and their history. And that is important to gather. In that when we think of natural disasters, when we think of Texas blizzards, and we think of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when we think of these things, we have to consider that for black communities and brown communities, communities that are historically disadvantaged or underserved, these situations are much worse. Because everything's lost. You know, many times. Everything is destroyed. And so we send our well wishes and our hope and our continual prayers and support for the people out there in Altadena, California, who are trying to rebuild or trying to relocate or trying to revitalize their community after that devastating loss still a year today. Another story, ICE actually detained a white Afrikaner national. Y'all know, Afrikaners are white South Africans, some of them, right? White South Africans. And it's actually another story that's important in noting. Benjamin Schoon Winkle is his name. A white South African Afrikaner was detained by ICE. Now we know why this is even newsworthy, right? Because had he been a black South African or a colored South African, which is a third category, it would probably not even make the news. But because he's white, and because we know that our president, Donald Trump, made a specific immigration decision bringing in white South Afrikaners into the United States with the story around that they were being killed for their farmland. And we know that there's a lot to that. That can be a whole conversation in itself. But Mr. Schoonwinkel thought that white was white in the United States. And he is flabbergasted that he was detained by ICE. There's no viral outrage, no media frenzy, no national panic. Just a quiet reminder. ICE doesn't discriminate. Universally. Until enforcement discretion kicks in. Generally, they round up everybody they think is immigrants, and then that's when you start to see them discriminate. But we also know that the Supreme Court has allowed them to use racial categories and ethnicity as a way to determine who should be rounded up by ICE. So there is a biased, prejudicial, racial component to it. And then when we see who is targeted the most aggressively, because I'm telling you a story about one South African here, but I can give you tons of stories about Latino populations and black African populations who have been targeted by ICE. We started the story off in Minnesota. We started the show off in Minnesota. But who is treated as though they are disposable the most? And these are black and brown immigrants. And who is framed as a permanent threat, right? Who is the conversation about when they say they are, quote unquote, off infesting our country, infiltrating our country? Who are they talking about? Not white South Afrikaners. Not any white immigrants. They're talking about below the border and from the African continent. Black from the African continent. I wish him well. This whole ICE move and it being a police patrol for the federal government, stationed in many different places around this country, poses a threat to me. And in some instances, them staying in hotels, them being quartered in homes of citizens, actually violate the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, in my opinion. But as I stated before, I am not a legal scholar. I am a historian. And so therefore I can only speak based on my experience, though I ground it in the facts. All right, switching gears just a little bit more to, I would say, a more positive story. DMX was posthumously ordained as a minister. If you ever listened to DMX, whether it was Hot and Hell is Dark, or any of his CDs, you knew one thing about DMX. He was a very spiritual, very religious, very Christian man. In fact, DMX ended his albums with a prayer. And that was one thing I would say about DMX, that despite the exterior, he was definitely a spiritually minded man. And if you know his story, growing up in an abusive home, pretty much running the streets as a child by himself. In fact, his name, Dogman X, came because he used to hang out with dogs because he trusted them more than he trusted humans. Because he had been done so wrong and had experienced so much trauma in his early childhood. I learned that from Ayala Fix My Life. And he talked about all of that. And so, but nevertheless, in spite of, he was always a spiritual person. So DMX will be posthumously ordained a minister. And honestly, like I said, this makes perfect sense. This was a man who prayed publicly, wrestled with God openly, and even carried spiritual conflict in his voice many times. DMX didn't perform faith. He lived faith. He lived inside of faith. He carried his faith. Messy, raw, unfiltered, just as it was. Some call that a contradiction, but the reality of it is the church calls it a calling. DMX preached to people in places that the church wouldn't go. DMX ministered to men in many places around the world. And so for that, I believe that this is a good decision to ordain DMX, because DMX didn't have to be ordained in this life, in his life, because he carried himself in a certain way. And this is why it's always important, in my opinion, to not judge a book by their cover. Sometimes something that might look rough on the outside is holding something inside that is more valuable than anything any of us can ever think of. So shouts out to DMX. Well deserved. May he continue to rest in peace. Because once again, my personal opinion, I feel like he had a very tumultuous, very complicated, very eventful, difficult experience through his walk of life. And so I hope that in his passing, in his death, he gets some measure of peace. And I think this is part of that peace. All right, let's shift to another story. We're story rich today, y'all. This is Wednesday, so we wilding it out on Wednesday. I want to talk about AI. AI is very innovative. And whether we like it or not, whether we can accept it or not, it's here. It ain't coming. It's here. And in it being here, it's going to come with so many things we're going to have to address, like job loss, like information accuracy, and like environmental injustice. Well, out of South Carolina, there's a situation in which AI is presenting a problem of environmental injustice for Black people. Now, this is not a new thing for us. We've experienced tons and tons and historical tons of environmental injustice. You can go as far as Lake Lanier, right, which was Oscarville, a town that was washed away for a man-made lake. You can go to Louisiana, the strip in Louisiana that's called Cancer Row, in which there are tons and tons of cancer-producing factories that are being emitted into areas that are predominantly Black and poor. So this is not new, what's happening in South Carolina. After a white town in South Carolina rejected a proposed data center for AI, it's where all the information is kept, these centers emit gases. These centers emit cancer-causing gases. In fact, there was a situation in Memphis in which Memphis Congressman Justin Pearson spoke about the injustice of putting these data centers in impoverished, black and brown, rural and poor areas. And so instead of them putting the data center somewhere else, when the white people rejected it, developers just simply relocated the project to a nearby black community in South Carolina. And my hope is that these people will speak out, but we know that black voices don't get heard in situations even when we do speak out. So this is why I'm mentioning it here. You know, we got to speak out for the people of South Carolina and help their voices be amplified at the environmental injustice that's happening. Same pollution, same environmental strain, they just relocated it to a different zip code. And like I said, this has already happened in Memphis area. This has already happened in different parts of Texas, where they've put these data centers in these areas, and these data centers emit and can harm people. And so, like I said, with AI, it's an interesting bag of tricks, and it's coming very rapidly and fast to us. And it is up to us to continue to speak truth about it, to continue to talk about how it can be harmful, and to negotiate and to make clear what we're expecting from these businesses putting these data centers in our neighborhoods. This is environmental racism with paperwork, and it is damn sure not new to the United States. Black land becomes the fallback when white communities say no. And we've seen it happen many times in our 250-year history here in the United States of America. And that has been Black News Now. Okay, it's time to switch gears. And let's talk about Black history. On Wednesdays, I'd like to introduce a segment in which we highlight Black history of the day. So we'll find stories of things that are in Black history that happened on this day, and we talk about it. And, and we have discussions about it, because I've learned as a historian and as a history professor and history educator that a lot of my people don't know our history. And there are not too many outlets giving our accurate history. So, of course, I'm going to use Black Truth Daily as a means to disseminate and to keep alive Black history. So, Black History Now. In 1787, we get the establishment of the Free African Society, which was formed in Philadelphia. And given that now we're in a time period in which our Africanness is being challenged due to all kinds of misinformation and things, it's important to even talk about the first Free African Society. This was established by free Black people who had paid their way, escaped their way, fought their way through the American Revolution out of slavery. It was one of the earliest mutual aid organizations in American history. And for those of you who aren't aware of a mutual aid organization, it's literally an organization that helps the community. And they share it. People share their things, and they share their things with other people in the community, helping people who can't help themselves. They provided health care. Now, mind you, this is in the late 1700s, 1787. They provided health care. They provided burial funds. They provided education and dignity when the state offered none of that. None of it. And the state didn't even offer that for white people. White people weren't getting healthcare, free healthcare. White people weren't getting their burial funds. This was before insurance companies was insuring burials for black people. And so we salute those brothers and sisters who in 1787 created the Free African Society, which is one of the first civil rights societies in U.S. history. And as with anything in American history, U.S. history, black people are always on the cutting edge of where we need to be. And eventually we catch up as a nation to where black people are, but black people are always leading the charge. Another historical fact that is good to talk about, interesting to know, in 1863, a couple of months after the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, in 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment was officially formed in the Civil War. And this was one of the first all-black battalion units in United States history to be recognized. And they were awarded for their valor in many battles. But you might know their story from them being portrayed in one of Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman's movies called Glory. If you've seen Glory, you've seen the story of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. And I recommend, if you haven't seen Glory, you can find it out here on YouTube. It's a fantastic movie. I used it in my history classes because it's just fantastic. It's fantastic. But the real story runs much deeper than just the movie, right? These men did not just fight the Confederacy. They escaped the Confederacy, some of them. They escaped the South and still faced discrimination, hatred, and racism in the North, in places like Massachusetts. So they didn't just have to fight the Confederacy, they also fought doubt. They fought, like I said, the racism of the Union Army. And they fought for citizenship with their bodies. And proved that they deserved the dignity and the appreciation that they brought to the United States Army. One of the common misconceptions is that white people came in and freed black people from slavery, when in reality, the push for emancipation came from escaping slaves, multiple hundreds of thousands, as well as men who served into these military units, proving to people like George Washington that we were more than just what they thought we were, which was subhuman. We were humans who deserve dignity, and we're willing to fight, to kill and be killed for our freedom. Something that we shouldn't even have to fight for in the first place. So shouts out to the 54th Infantry Regiment. Thank y'all for y'all service. You don't get enough appreciation in U.S. history, and I'm here to say I appreciate you. I value y'all. Thank you for what you're doing, because I'm able to be here doing what I do because of men and women like you. So let's wrap it up. Let's wrap it up, okay? History doesn't repeat itself. And we've talked a few things related to history, as we talked about the slave patrols, we talked about the 54th Infantry, as we talked about the African Free People Society, and all kinds of other things that shows that there are trickles and reminders of history. But what history does is it doesn't repeat itself, it rebrands. But at the end of the day, and at the core and crux of it all, it's the same power, it's the same pattern, it's just wearing new uniforms. And until, as a collective in the United States, we are able to see that and understand that and gather that, we're doomed to continue to repeat the things that history should teach us. And until we learn the lessons are going to keep coming. But I subscribe to the idea that there is a blessing in the lesson. And so I take lessons as a challenge to stretch and grow myself. And hopefully one day, America and most Americans